right. Hi, everybody. My name is Toby Farley. I'm the director of the Philmont Public Library. This program this evening is presented to you by the Philmont Library, the Claverack Library, the Hudson Library, and the Roeliff Jansen Library. And we thank everybody for registering and having the interest to come tonight. We're very excited. We have a large number of people have signed up. This is the last in the series of this season. I'm sure Jeff will be happy to do more for us. If you have any interest in more, you can always write to any of the 4 libraries. My email is library@philmont.org, and you can let us know if you have an interest in a particular topic that we can have as one of our next programs in our next series. So I present to you Mr. Jeff Urbin from the FDR Museum and Library.
Well, hello, everybody. Thanks for tuning in tonight. And it is good to be here around the warm glow of the computer because it is cold out there, and I understand it's going to get even colder. I hope everybody's having a happy new year so far, and I hope everybody had a safe and happy and meaningful holiday season. So as Toby said, I'm Jeff Urbin from the Roosevelt Presidential Library. We're still in a partial shutdown like everybody else, and just trying to get through this COVID thing as best we can, and we will do that. So better days are ahead. Just hang in there. So tonight we're going to talk about pack horse librarians, which is a little known group of people, women primarily, who operated during the Great Depression. And I'm going to talk a little bit about who they were, what they did, the kinds of things that they, the kinds of services they provided as they went about their way. But first, let's talk a little bit about footwear, shall we? The pandemic's been on. I've been using my local library to read a lot of the classics. One of my favorite, of course, Cinderella. And if Cinderella taught us nothing, she taught us that shoes are very critical to the job. And the women that we're going to be talking about tonight wore shoes that look like this, and they worked with a partner who wore shoes that look like this. So keep these things in mind as we're going through our presentation tonight, because these were critically important to getting the job done. Now, the Great Depression, let's talk a little bit about that first so we can understand the context under which these women were working. The Great Depression, of course, an unprecedented time. We hear that word a lot these days, unprecedented, but the Great Depression was an unprecedented time as well of economic hardship in the United States. Not just economic hardship, but also social hardship and emotional hardship as well. And you can know that just from going through this pandemic here, right? It's not just about whether or not you're sick or not. It's about how you feel about this whole thing that's going on, and the kinds of things it's keeping you from doing. And that's what the Great Depression did in the 1930s. There was 25% unemployment in the country, another 25% of underemployment. So 50% of the population didn't have acceptable or jobs that they were able to make a living with. There were farm closures going on, sometimes 1,000 a day at the peak of the farm closure period. Bank closures, almost 1,000 a day there as well, and lots of factory closures as well. And one of the hardest hit places in the country was Appalachia. Now, some people say Appalachia, some people say Appalachia. I think it's interchangeable. I'm going to use, I don't know which one I'm going to use. I'm going to go back and forth, I think. But anyway, this area of Appalachia was experiencing 40% unemployment. Now, that's while the rest of the country was experiencing only, I say only, 25% unemployment. This area of the country was experiencing 40% unemployment. These folks were dirt farmers and coal miners primarily. And of course, with the situation going on with the Dust Bowl, which was primarily out in the little bit further west, but the impact and effects were still being felt in the Appalachian area. And of course, with the coal mines, with railroads shutting down, with factories shutting down, there wasn't a whole lot of demand for coal. And so the coal miners were laid off as well. And a lot of these folks had really barely been making a living even before the Great Depression. You know, it was hard times even before the hard times of the Great Depression hit. And Roosevelt understood that, you know, this was not only an economic problem, but a social and an emotional problem as well. And therefore, many of his relief programs were designed to bring about jobs. And jobs were important for two reasons. For an economic reason of, I get a job, I get a paycheck. I get a paycheck, I spend that paycheck, and then that creates demand for other goods and services in the community, right? So it becomes a little economic engine. You know, if I've got a job, I'm going to go out there, I'm going to buy stuff, and that's going to make the pizza guy have to hire more people. And, I'm going to hire the carpenter now to put the porch on my back porch or back of my house, those sorts of things. So it begins to build an economic engine. But equally important, having a job gives you a purpose, right? It gives you something that you have to do each day, right? It gives you a reason to get up, a place to go, a sense of accomplishment, a sense of contribution to making things happen and making things work. And that was really, really important for folks as well. Now, one of the most important job programs, there were three basic large ones: the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Tennessee Valley Authority, and the really big one, the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. Between those three programs, they put millions and millions of people to work. And between those three programs, half of the infrastructure in the United States was created during the Great Depression. That's why it's so important to be spending money on it now, because much of it was built 80 years ago and it's starting to fall apart. Now, the WPA was known for its big projects. And so it did a lot of big, projects like building dams, and think of the number of jobs that go into this, right? You've got to have surveyors, you've got to have truck drivers, you've got to have carpenters, you've got to have plumbers, you got to have, cement mixers, you got to have, support people like secretaries and payroll people and those sorts of things. So even just one project can create a lot of job stimulation. And that was what the goal of this thing was. And these were big projects. I can show you this. Look at this. Here is a waterworks project being done by the WPA. And here is a section of pipe. And look at this. You can drive through this. And here's a man standing here. So let's say this guy is 6 feet tall, right? You go like another 6 or 7 of him, and that's how wide this pipe is. This car could easily drive through here, and probably 4 more cars on top of that. So these were big time projects, big construction. Here's FDR at a dam that's getting ready. This is actually the Boulder Dam. And, here he is, and he's reviewing what's going on here and taking a look at this. And, big time projects. For artists, people who weren't necessarily going to be, able to do construction work, or didn't want to do construction work, or didn't have the skills or the temperament to do construction work, there were other jobs created. Things like painting murals in post offices, in hospitals and schools and government buildings all across the country. And so folks that had those kinds of skills were able to find work as well. Now, one of the important things about these WPA projects is that FDR liked to get his name on them. So here is a WPA project, and nice and easily noticeable, Franklin D. Roosevelt, President of the United States. Why? Because Roosevelt wanted you to know that if you had a job on this site, you had him to thank for that. And he likes to remind you of this every day when you're going into work, so that come voting time, come election day, you can remember who gave you that job, your good pal, Franklin Roosevelt. And, maybe you could think of him on election day as well. And here's another one, just to give you another example of these kinds of things. So even, even people who painted signs, right, like this, or made, posters of signs, had jobs going on there as well. Now, that's the WPA, and most people know about that. And, some of these big time projects like the Triborough Bridge, airports, seaports, pipelines, roadways, electricity, you name it, these guys were involved in this sort of thing. But a little known segment of the WPA gets very little attention and almost none of the glory, and yet it is an incredible story, and that's the one I'm going to share with you tonight. That is the story of the Pack Horse Librarians. And the Pack Horse Librarians were a group of nearly 1,000 women over the course of the program who delivered books and Bibles and other reading materials to people all across the southeastern section of Kentucky, an estimated 1.5 million people living in that area between 1935 and 1943. So just as you're enjoying your little local public libraries, you know, who've pulled together and put together this program and have had so many other wonderful programs and such, well, that's what these folks were going to do as well. They weren't going to let something get in the way of, stopping them from getting books out there to folks. The idea for the program can be traced back to Paintsville, Kentucky in 1913. There was a woman by the name of Mary Stafford, and she was supported by a local coal baron by the name of John C.C. Mayo. And Mayo had begun to help her deliver books to folks who were out in the countryside. Now, Mayo had a lot of money, and so he said, all right, I can fund this program for you. Sure, you want to get books out to folks out in the hinterland? I'm your man, right? I will help fund this program for you. And this worked out really, really well for just a little over a year. And then a little over a year later, Mr. Mayo passed away, and he left no provision in his will to continue the funding for the program. Now, at the time of the Great Depression, the American Library Association estimated that about a third of the people who lived in the country were without service from public libraries. Either they were too far away and they couldn't, people couldn't get there due to transportation costs, or the libraries had to shut down due to staffing costs. But 1 out of every 3 people who had depended on libraries were no longer able to depend on libraries. Now, the Paintsville Plan died out along with John Mayo in 1914, but there was a woman by the name of Elizabeth Fullerton of Leslie County, Kentucky, and she had remembered the program as a young girl and how successful it was and how great it was to get books, from the traveling librarians and such. And so she wanted to find a way to bring that back. And she wanted to find a way to make that happen. Now, the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, which focused so much on construction projects, big kinds of construction projects, generally did not hire women. It hired some women to do books, to do ordering, payroll, that sort of thing, but not a lot of women employed in the WPA. But they were looking for ways to get more women into the WPA. And they got the ear of Eleanor Roosevelt, and Eleanor Roosevelt supported this idea of creating a program in the WPA that would allow women to be hired. And the program was the Pack Horse Librarians. And it was passed under Public Law 1517, and it became part of the WPA. Sometimes these ladies were called book women, sometimes they were called book ladies. Pack Horse Librarians is the term that I use, but if you're Googling this sort of thing, you can use any of those, and they're all pretty well interchangeable. These were women, many of whom were the only ones in their families who were actually earning a living and still living at home. The men had given up on the farms or the coal mines. Many of them, went off to work on some of the WPA projects around the country. But the women stayed home to, take care of the farm, to take care of the house, to take care of the children. And these women who remained and became part of this Pack Horse Librarian group earned $28 per month to deliver books on routes that were sometimes 18 or 20 miles per day. They would travel by horseback or by foot in order to get these books out. And they were making $28 per month, so less than $1 a day on average. These were tough women, between the ages generally of 25 and 35 years old, and they were local women, familiar with the people and the topography and the terrain of the areas. And these women were women who could get out there in the sun, could get out there in the winter, in the wind, in the rain, in the snow, and we're not afraid of those climatic conditions in order to get this job done. So they got paid just a little under $1 a day, and the payment from the government through the WPA provided only for salaries. Everything else that they needed, they had to come up with on their own. So there was a little bit of a catch to this. Okay, women, we'll hire you to be part of the WPA in this pack horse librarian program, and we'll pay you about $1 a day, a little less than $1 a day. But that's all we're doing. We're only going to provide the salary. You have to come up with everything else. You've got to come up with the books. You've got to come up with the bookkeeping procedures and material that you need for that. You have to come up with the horses. You have to plan the routes. You have to have the maps. Everything else you do, we'll give you a little less than $1 a day. So there were book drives that were held to collect books for the programs and magazines and pamphlets and Bibles and journals and all sorts of other reading paraphernalia and periodicals and such. And these book drives would collect these books. And then the books needed to be made trail worthy because, you know, these women were out there riding on these rough terrains and far distances. So what they did was they organized themselves into monthly conferences. And what they would do is they would meet once a month someplace in the village, somewhere in town. So it might be the basement of the church. It might be the room behind the general store. It might be in someone's house. And they would advertise that, okay, we're going to have this book conference and this book collection on a certain date. People would bring their books, and the women would make sort of a day of it, and they would bring the books in, they would catalog them, they would take a look at them, they would repair whatever needed to be fixed. And what they were basically doing was preparing these books to go out on to the circuits. Now, here is a picture of a group of pack horse women, and they are heading out on their route. Now, what they're doing is they are going up a essentially dried river or stream bed. Now you see the water over here, but you can see it's kind of receded a bit here. So these women are using this river, this dried riverbed, basically as their roadway to get up into the mountains. Now there's 4 of them that are here, but this is just because they're just sort of starting out. And what they'll do is, as they go up the river, one will go off one way, another will go off another will go off another way, and they will go out and service the routes that they need to go to in order to get the books out there to the folks. So at the monthly conferences, the books would come in and they would catalog them, and they had to keep the records themselves. And so very often the card catalogs that these women used were nothing more than a cheese box with cards placed in it, scraps of paper, basically, you know, some leftover pencils or whatever they could, you know, scrounge up and such. And this is how they kept track. No computers, no real live card catalogs, cheese boxes, and, you know, slips of paper in order to categorize what the book was, which route it was going out on, the condition it was in, and those sorts of things as well. Now, at these monthly conferences, the books were collected and they were repaired. So if they needed to be pasted back together, the women had to come up with the paste themselves. And they would either do that by having it contributed to someone, or they would end up having someone donate it, let's say, or they would maybe pool their money and buy this stuff, you know, that they needed to repair these things as well. In addition to that, every book that went out with a bookmark. And the bookmarks were very, very important. They were made out of nothing more than old greeting cards. You know, here's an old Christmas card. Here's a Christmas card, a greeting card that is being used as a bookmark. Here's a seed catalog or a seed packet that's being used to have a little string attached to it. And it was really important for these books to go out with these bookmarks. Every book that went out with a bookmark. And the reason for that was because they had to make these books last. So if you were sending these books out without bookmarks, the books would generally come back in a lot worse shape than they went out. Sometimes people would read them, and when they want to save their page, they would, you know, bend it over and just kind of, you know, put it over on the table or put it over the arm of the chair, and that wasn't good for the spine of the back. Or what they might do is they might ear the page, bend the page down, which is great for them if it's their book. But if hundreds of other people are going to be using this over the course of a couple of years, those books aren't going to last very long. Now, my sister, who I love, don't get me wrong, but my sister is one of those people that dog ears the books. Don't ever, ever lend my sister a book, because if you do, it's going to come back with the dog ears things. She won't use a bookmark or a piece of string or anything like that. She's got to bend the pages. But in addition to that, she's also into origami. So when you get your books back, they end up looking like this. And this is really hard. Try putting that back on the shelf after lending a book to my sister. So if you see her and she asks for a book, don't let her take it. Don't let her do that. So the monthly conferences were kind of a social event, and they were also this working event. The records kept in the little, cheese box card catalogs, as I had said. Now, if the books got too worn, what they would do is they would be cannibalized. They would be taken apart, and any useful parts of the book would then be reused. So maybe the cover was in still pretty good shape. So what they might do is they might make bookmarks out of the cover, or if there were particular pictures in the books, they might take the pictures out, get rid of the rest of the book, which was too far gone to repair, and then they would use the pictures in these scrapbooks that they would create at these monthly conferences as well. Now let's take a look at what a pack horse librarian might look like. So here is a picture of an actual pack horse librarian. And this pack horse librarian is got her satchel of books over here. She's got a pile up here, and she is working her way down a fence line along somebody's farm. And, you got the crops over here, you got the wilderness over here, and farmers would generally leave some area around the outside of their fields because the crops over here would need the water, and if it was right up against the wilderness, these trees would steal that water, and also these trees over here would provide shade, which would mean that this area in here wouldn't grow very well, so they would leave these areas unplowed and such. And the pack horse librarians made use of these areas as pathways. Now you might say, well, wait a minute now, Jeff, this woman is going to be delivering these books in the cold and in the summer and then, all these crazy conditions. Look at the shoes she's wearing. That's a pretty nice blouse. This is not really how the pack horse women dressed on an average day. But there's a story behind why this woman is so properly dressed and so nicely dressed for this picture. And that is that Franklin Roosevelt created a program called the Farm Security Administration. And the Farm Security Administration's job was to go out and take pictures of conditions in the country. And the FSA, the Farm Security Administration, took over 80,000 pictures. I would be willing to bet that any picture you've ever seen from the Great Depression, unless it was taken by a family member, was probably taken by a photographer of the FSA. One of the most notable, of course, being Dorothea Lange. The idea was to go out, take pictures of conditions in the country, then FDR would bring in his New Deal programs. Then the FSA would go out and take pictures again, a year or two later, 3 years later, and you'd be able to have a before and after contrast to how bad things were to how good things got. Now, when it came time to photograph the pack horse librarians, the FSA said, "Hey, ladies, we're going to be out there next Tuesday to take some pictures. So, just so you know, we're coming out there." And these women heard this and like, "Well, gee, I got to get all gussied up here. I want to look good for these pictures." And that's why this woman is dressed as well as she is. Ordinarily, she would probably be dressed in, certainly boots, a hat, maybe some gloves, and not in what almost looks like a business apparel, really, in terms of what she's got going on there. Now, here is a picture of another pack horse librarian, and again, we see the same thing, right? She's got her nice collared shirt on, right? And she's got her nice little cap and her nice cute little shoes, and she's on this, pretty looking horse here. And, I wouldn't say it's a staged picture, but they knew the photographers were coming out. And so that's why they kind of spiffed themselves up a little bit. Now, these women would get these horses from the local farms, and you could rent a horse for about 50 cents a week. And that was good money for the horse, right? Because the horse, many of the farms had, stopped planting. So the horse was just standing around, basically eating hay all day and not earning his keep on the farm. But by renting out these horses for 50 cents a week, the farmer was making 50 cents. The pack horse librarian lady was not having to, hoof it, but her own hoof. She could use the horse's hoofs to get where she wanted to go. And she also was able to, travel further and travel more comfortably than to have to trounce through the mud. So the horses were getting exercise, they were getting used, the farmer was making some money, the pack horse librarian was making out pretty well in the deal also. Now the routes were planned out at these monthly conferences. So they'd get together and they'd say, okay, well, we're going to go in this area here, we're going to have 15 routes. And what we'll do is we'll put these routes together and we'll go out on these rotations with these routes. Using the e-card catalog, they were able to keep track of where the books were at the various places along the routes. And they were able to get a sense of when the books were out and when the books were going to be coming back. So if you were on Route 3 and you really wanted to read Gulliver's Travels, let's say, they would know that, oh, Gulliver's Travels is out on Route 1 and it probably won't be back for another couple of weeks. And this is how they kept track of the way these books were moving around and where they were going as they went out onto the routes. So this was all planned out at the monthly conferences and such. Now, when you see this horseback librarian here, wouldn't you just love to get a look at inside that sack? Wouldn't you just love to get a sense of what's going on here and what kinds of stuff that she has in that sack? Well, through the modern miracle of reproduction, I happen to have one of those sacks right here, very similar to the one that the pack horse librarian has. Now they're called pack horse librarians because sometimes the women would use packs to carry these books around. But in reality, they used anything they could get their hands on. Sometimes they would fashion apple crates on the back of the horse, and carry the books that way. Sometimes they would use suitcases. The woman we saw earlier had a satchel, but very often they would use an old pillowcase or an old, feed bag or a flour sack rather, in order to carry these books around and get them out onto their routes. So let's take a look at the kinds of things that you might find in the satchel of a pack horse librarian. The most important and most circulated book on the routes was the Bible. So people love to have Bibles come to them if they didn't have a family Bible. And the Bible was really important because, again, we're talking about the southeastern portion of Kentucky. So this is, in the heart of the Bible Belt. And these folks are very, God-loving, God-fearing, and they want to learn more about God and their religion and such. The other thing about the Bibles that were so important was that most people were familiar with the stories in the Bible. Right? So even if you weren't necessarily a good reader or a great reader, you could kind of make out what was going on through this book because you were already familiar with the story and you were able to piece it together between spot reading and knowing what the story is. You could put the story together that way. These books were also, the Bibles were also used very often to plan Sunday school lessons for children in farm communities and such. So they didn't have textbooks, so they would use the Bible to be able to pull out stories and things like that as well. Also very popular among the routes that and the books that were put out there were children's stories. And the children's stories were really important because the books, the print in children's books tends to be rather simple and rather large. Now, again, these are people who, there's not a lot of, there's a lack of literacy, let's say. A lot of folks could barely read or, could kind of piece things together, but these were not strong readers necessarily. So the simpler the book, the better it was able to be, processed and read and, ingested and such. Also, these folks lacked medical care. So if Granny or Gramps' eyesight was going, they may not get new glasses, or they may not ever have glasses, or they may have a set of glasses they got 20 years ago. So they needed the big print in books that are written for children because it was easier for them to see by oil light or by campfire or fireside in the cabin. So books like Treasure Island. Right. Also, these books tended to be very colorful, and they tended to have very nice illustrations and such. So again, if you couldn't read, you could at least see the story here or the picture, and you could begin to make out what was going on based upon that. Adventures of Robin Hood, very, very popular along the circuits. And that was because, of course, you had a guy here who was stealing from the rich and giving to the poor. That was a very popular theme during the Great Depression. In fact, many of our famous gangsters picked up that theme, Bonnie and Clyde, Dillinger, those kinds of folks, rob from the rich, give to the poor, which happened to themselves. But anyway, you see the Robin Hood here, there as well. Classics like Hansel and Gretel, easy to read. Most folks know the story, beautiful illustrations, large print, relatively easy for a large audience to become involved with. Here is a spy in Williamsburg. So again, you can see kind of the conditions some of these books were in. They weren't the greatest books, but they were books, and they were being brought out there to folks along these trails. In addition to the Bible and storybooks, there were also practical application books. So here is a pamphlet on kerosene lamps. So you could get this, and this would teach you and give you pointers on how to keep up your kerosene lamps while you're out there, waiting for the Great Depression to work its way through. And sometimes there would be simple pictures or illustrations in these books as well to help you out in that as you read. Also, people like to have entertainment just for the fun of entertaining. So it was kind of fun to see how the other half lived. So you might, have somebody donate the red book, and here's the October version, or edition, I should say. And this would go out, and you could get a chance to see how the fancy movie stars and the fancy people that were doing pretty well, the way that they were living out there, and you could kind of live vicariously through them, kind of like the Kardashians maybe today. Pops might be interested in the American magazine, where you could learn about manly things like golfing and fishing and those sorts of things. Probably not too many people out in Appalachia were into golfing back in those days, but it was kind of fun to hear about other folks that were, and to sort of see how these fancy folks were able to spend their time when they had the time and the money to do that. Also very popular among the circuit was the National Geographic. And these were important and valuable on the trail because these books tended to last a good long time in terms of their topicality. So this book, this magazine, this edition is about the patterns of migration of the hummingbird. And of course, that happens each year at a certain time. So if this book, this magazine were to be out on the route for, let's say, 5 or 6 years, during the humming season, transition, when these guys were, migrating from one place to the other, this story would suddenly be pertinent again. The story would suddenly be topical again. So it didn't have a time expiration, really, in terms of the way those things tended to work out. Now, the women that they hired were local women, and that was really important because these women knew the topography, they knew the terrain, they knew where they were going, right? You don't want to just get a bunch of books, go out on a horse, and just head out into the wilderness. That's not going to be a good thing. But these women who had been born in these areas, grew up in these areas, knew people in these areas, they knew how to get where they needed to go and how to get safely back to where they needed to get. In addition to that, because these were local women, the people out in the hinterland tended to know them as well. Or if they didn't know them, then they would at least know somebody that maybe knew somebody that they knew. So this was really important because, the folks that came in from outside were known as flatlanders. right? We don't want no flatlanders coming in around here. Stranger, what are you doing here in this part of town? So when these women would ride up to the farm for the first time, and they might be met with a shotgun, hey, who are you? What do you want here? What are you doing? Are you a revenuer? No, 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 no. I'm Sally Banks, and I'm here to deliver books. You may know my uncle. He runs the mill in town. Oh yeah, Mr. Banks. Yeah, I got my boards from him for the barn. Sure, come on in. And this was a way of entering into these areas and getting into these places that other people from the outside community would not have been able to do. Now, these pack horse librarians would come and they would deliver these books, and very often they would sit and read for a little bit with the family. So this gave them a break from being on the back of the horse and out in the wilderness. It gave them an opportunity to sit down on the porch or sit down in the parlor and read a couple of pages or a chapter to a family. They might be offered a piece of cake or a piece of pie or maybe a sandwich. If it got late in the evening, they might be invited to stay over and get out on the route again in the morning. And this was a wonderful way for these women to sort of get a little bit of respite along the way, a little bit of food, and to get out of the elements for a little while. It also increased the literacy along the route, because what these women would do is they would sometimes challenge the family, say, okay, I'm going to read this chapter to you, and then I'm going to leave the book with you. And when I come back, right, you're going to hear me read this chapter, you're going to understand what's in this chapter, and you're going to now spend the next couple of weeks reading over this chapter again and working on your reading. And when I come back, I want you to read this chapter to me. And what this did was it helped these people to increase their reading skills. These were intelligent people. These were folks who knew, these were not dumb folks. These were folks who knew what they knew, but they didn't always have access to education or to school, or certainly colleges and universities. So, they had some basic reading skills, but the pack horse librarian became sort of a literacy program going along here as well. Now, sometimes the books were not enough, and so they needed to get new books, or the books would wear out. And in order to raise money, sometimes what they would do is they would have penny drives. So as they were out in the routes, they might say to the family, listen, I'm here every couple of weeks, and I think you value this. If you happen to have a couple of pennies laying around, we could really use them to buy some paste, or to buy some new books, or to, one of the horses is having a birthday. We want to, sometimes people would donate pennies, and these penny drives were literally pennies that were donated to the pack horse librarians, and they raised money and funding that way. Now, one penny drive raised $52. It was notable for raising $52. Imagine $52 raised in pennies. Sometimes schools had fallen on hard times, and they couldn't afford to pay the teachers. So they laid them off, and the books just sat, the textbooks sat in the school with nobody using them. So sometimes they were incorporated into the routes as well, so that the kids could get textbooks brought to the house through the pack horse librarians. The local PTAs would help to arrange that. In Lee County, Kentucky, they held a pie supper, and they raised $18.50 just selling slices of pie. In Jackson County, Kentucky, there was a play that was written called Go Slow Mary. And Go Slow Mary was about a pack horse librarian who came into town one day, and she was going too fast, and her satchel opened up and the books all spilled out on the ground. And of course, this is, these books were very, very valuable, and they were damaged. So the idea was they wrote a play about this, and it's called Go Slow Mary. So Mary, when you're coming into town, go slow. Don't break those books. Don't hurt those books. And this play raised $17.25. Now, this is not a lot of money to you and I, right? It's like $17.25. It's like a trip to Burger King, right? But for people out in the hinterlands of Appalachia in 1938 Depression America, this was big money. And this was money that needed to be raised because the government was only funding the salaries of the women, nothing else. No supplies, no books, no repair equipment, none of that sort of stuff. Periodically, there would be an article that would be run in a newspaper across the country about these pack horse librarians. They raised a lot of interest. And so one time there was an article that was syndicated to a bunch of places across the country. And between November 1st, 1936 and March 4th, 1937, those articles raised 2,351 books and 11,433 magazines that people then sent into the county to be worked with through the pack horse librarians. And they came from 18 states. So people were really sending in and helping out with this. It's estimated that you needed about 10,000 books or magazines, pamphlets, those sorts of things in order to service a county effectively. And, of course, you would start with whatever you had, you would build up from that. But the goal was to try to get 10,000 books for your county. And by 1937, it's estimated that there were 60,000 books in circulation. 155 public schools were being served through this, ones that were still open were getting books for their libraries through the pack horse librarians. And they estimate about 1.5 million people spread out over about 26,000 families throughout the area. Now, I mentioned the scrapbooks, right? When a book became too worn to go out on the route at the monthly conference, it would be cut up, cannibalized, and made into a scrapbook. And I happen to have a copy of one of those right here. So it's nothing more than a binding, spiral notebook this is Harlan County Pack Horse Library, Works Progress Administration, London, Kentucky, District number 4. And what this was is inside here, it would be cutouts of recipes. It would be cutouts of fashion things, articles. There was designs for dresses, simple dresses that people might share with each other through the routes and such. Here's an article of Josephine, Woman of Fortune, that was obviously in some other magazine, but the magazine was no longer fit for the road, but the article was saved, and now you still got this article here in this scrapbook. So it continues on with that. Here, another example of a lot of nice pictures. Right. So again, if you are not able to read, let's say you've got a second or third grade reading level, or let's say grandma never went to school and she can't really read at all. Well, she could get the kids up on her lap, take a look at this picture, and she could make up a story about this. Oh yeah, this is the time old man Jenkins came down in his motor car, came whipping down the valley and ran right into the stream, almost knocked Holly off of her, canoe over there. And boy, what a time that was. And she could make up this whole story about this. And we know from reading that being read to is really important. Okay, being read to. So when kids are little, if they are read to, that helps to make them strong readers, and it helps to build in them a love of reading. And when you're little and you're young, what you're doing is you're learning to read. Once you get to about third or fourth grade, then you begin reading to learn. So this was an important thing here as well, because even if grandma couldn't read, she could at least tell a story, and that was building this love of storytelling and this love of story hearing, and AKA also reading into these children. And here's the thing about the theater projects that were also part of the WPA. So they've got some of these things in here as well. Sometimes there just would be pictures, but I want to share one of my favorite things. Now it's coming up on 6:45, so most of you probably already had dinner, so it's probably too late for you tonight for this, but I want to read you two of my favorite recipes in here. And you could jot these down if you like, and cook them maybe for tomorrow night if you got some friends coming over. The first is baked opossum. And the way you do this is you first dress the opossum and stew until tender. Then place small twigs or limbs of spicewood in a pan with the opossum to flavor. Add some pepper, lard, salt, and bake. Your mouth's probably watering right now, isn't it? Now, opossum may not be for you, right? Sometimes I find opossum a bit heavy. So maybe you want some baked groundhog. And that's even simpler to make. All you do is parboil until tender, get some spicewood switches, lay them under and over, and place them in the oven and bake. Now, if you think I'm kidding, here they are right here. I'll hold them right up to the screen for you. So you can take a screenshot of that and then make this for your friends when they come over maybe this weekend. So this is the kind of stuff that was being circulated and going out and going around out in these sorts of things. Oh, and then another thing that was very popular was quilt making. Everybody had their own sort of designs for quilts, and they would share these things back and forth because that, again, was a nice homespun activity that Granny could do with the kids, and you could do it with scraps of material, left over from Susie's dress, or, a tent or whatever it was you happen to have laying around that you were able to, to get some cloth material for and make quilts and such. Now, by 1943, the Packhorse Librarian Program came to an end. And it came to an end primarily because of the war. We were in the war starting in December 7th, 1941. And what happened was the men were sent off to the war, and women began to be able to find jobs in factories, in the defense industries, and the whole focus of the country changed from getting along through the Great Depression to winning the World War. In addition to this, the projects of the WPA had to be finished up so that they could, those resources could be then sent to the war effort. And the things they were finishing up, the waterworks, the port, repairs, the airports, the train things, that sort of stuff was then used in the war effort as well. And so the Packhorse Librarian Program came to an end, and many of the books and many of the scrapbooks and many of the card catalogs didn't survive because they were used for the war effort, right? The paper from these things was needed to now be recycled into training manuals and maps and, paper for keeping records on personnel and those sorts of things as well. So it was terminated in 1943. So between 1935 and 1943, about 1,000 women participated. There were probably around 200 or so Packhorse librarians operating at any given time in this one little section of southeastern Kentucky. This was a very popular program there. It was tried and was met with moderate success in other parts of the country, but this is really where it took root and really where it blossomed. It was an important program for a lot of reasons. Number one was it gave women jobs, right? And it gave women jobs where they were. They could work in their own community. So they could go out on these routes, and when they weren't out on the routes, they could be home tending the family. It promoted literacy by encouraging people to read, and by helping these Packhorse librarians, helping the other folks learn how to read or to improve their reading skills. Literacy made getting a job easier. If you can't read a training manual, if you can't read a job application, how are you going to apply for a job? So it increased employment there as well. It also promoted a sense of community, right? You know how sometimes we're feeling like we're cut off, right? You're out there, I'm here, we're all sort of out there, but we can come together through this technology and we can spend an hour together talking about something, right? And that's what the women did at these conferences, the monthly conferences. And that's what these women did in the barnyards and on the front porches and on the stoops and pathways of these little houses all across the hinterland of southeastern Dutchess, not Dutchess County, but southeastern Kentucky. It also, President Roosevelt liked this because he felt that it made people less susceptible to snake oil salesmen. President Roosevelt believed that if people could read, if people could get ideas, if people could get ideas from outside of their own community, it would open their minds to a broader perspective. It would open their minds to a broader world, and it would make it harder for them to fall for snake oil salesmen and shysters and people like that. And this was particularly important to President Roosevelt because keep in mind, ladies and gentlemen, at the time that these Packhorse librarians are out there delivering their books in places like Europe, Hitler is burning books. So Roosevelt is promoting book distribution, and Hitler is promoting book, destruction. It also helped to promote democracy because when people have critical thinking skills, they're able to make better choices about who they want to be their leaders and the kinds of things that they want to have in their communities and the ways that they might go about getting those sorts of things. And it was a wonderful partnership between the government and the communities and the private sector, basically. So the government paid for the salaries. It would have been nice if they had kicked a little stipend in for some supplies and things, but hey, you got to take what you can get. It's the Great Depression. And this was an opportunity to have the government come in, pay a little bit, and these resourceful young women come up with ideas and ways to make it work, in the other half of the equation. We've got to pay for the salaries. All we need to do is provide everything else, and we'll be in good shape. And most important of all, I think, is it spoke to the spirit of librarians. Right? Librarians, our little local libraries, how important they are, how important the people who work at them are. These are important places and these are important people because they allow us access to so much information. When computers first came out, everybody was like, well, we're not going to need libraries anymore because you can just click, 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 and you got everything at the fingertips of the in the whole wide world at your fingertips. But a lot of people didn't have computers when they first came out, or they couldn't afford them. So where did they go? To their local library, which generally had these computers that were able to be used by folks. And, they've just continued to reinvent themselves over and over and over again, right on up to and including right now, where we're talking back and forth with each other here through this technology, despite the fact that many of these libraries are not operating at full capacity because of the pandemic. So as soon as it's safe, when the pandemic is over, go and hug your local librarian and thank them for the work that they do and the service that they provide. And if you can, support your local library. Really, really important. Now we'll open it up to some Q&A here.
Thanks, Jeff. There's one great question here that asked, were cookbooks or books with recipes popular?
Generally speaking, the recipes that were put around were very homespun recipes that were put through the scrapbooks, because the books that the recipes and things you would find generally in cookbooks depended upon a lot of ingredients and such, and are very often far fancier than the folks that were in this area were able to provide for themselves. So you'd be better off, like those two that I read, and I'm not kidding, those are real recipes, but that's the kind of stuff that people were cooking out there in those areas. So I don't think cookbooks were so important as individual recipes and such. And if you had, a good recipe for a jam that you could make out of huckleberries or something from the local area, that might be spread around the area through the scrapbooks. Anybody else?
There's a bunch of comments in the chat session if you'd like to look at that. And anybody else who'd like to ask a question can either put it in the chat or in the question box.
Okay, well, I see a mail carrier here who spent 5 hours out there today in the cold delivering mail. As a federal employee myself, I thank you for your service. And I thank you for bringing the fun mail, not the bills. Nobody likes those, but that's not your fault. That's not your fault. You're not responsible for that. Let's see, $28 a month in the 1930s is about the same as $600 a month. Still a very small amount. Yeah, not a lot of money, but pretty good money for back in the day. Especially in Appalachia, where it was either that or go work in a closed down coal mine. Hard to ride a horse in a dress, need slacks. I'm a rider, my daughter, a librarian. Oh, very nice. So together you guys make a horseback librarian. That's wonderful. And you're right, it is hard to ride a horse in a dress. Not that I know personally. Okay, let's see. Unridden horses and can be challenged to bring back under saddle. Give them a lot of credit. Yeah, so these women, by keeping these horses, active and keeping these horses used to, being saddled up and bridled and, worked, kept the work ethic in these horses so that they wouldn't have to be retrained later on. I remember the bookmobile coming to the outlying schools in our area once every 6 weeks or so. My mom was a librarian for over 50 years. Awesome. She loved her job, especially helping young children. Love this presentation. Thanks. Oh, thank you. The bookmobiles were actually, you can kind of think of the pack horse librarians as the great grandmas of the bookmobiles. The bookmobiles were popular, not so much in the 40s because of the war and the rationing of gas, but in the 50s, the bookmobiles became very popular then, and they would travel around. And it was the same basic idea of the pack horse librarian. So they had proven this idea works, and so therefore, it was picked up again. Any idea why the program was most successful in Kentucky and less so elsewhere? Great info, thanks. That's a great question, Dave. I don't really know. It had the history of this going back to Mr. Mayo at the turn of the century, the 19 teens, having supported this and such. It was replicated in some places, but never as famously or never as successfully as the folks out there in that part of Kentucky. So I don't know if there was just more of a need, if there was a history of having had something like this, and so it was a more acceptable idea. I really can't tell you, and I wish I could, but I'm afraid I can't. While the ladies were being paid about $28 a month, how much were men employed by the WPA paid? Ooh, good question. I see a hint of maybe some sexism in there. The men were paid, it depended upon the project, depended upon the part of the country they were in, and it depended upon their skill. Sometimes they would be paid maybe 50 cents an hour. Sometimes they would be paid a set price for a week or for a month. I know that the Civilian Conservation Corps paid about $30 a month, and those were mostly men. So yeah, there definitely was a higher rate of pay. Now here's another interesting thing about this. Women who were teachers during the Great Depression very often, and actually this goes back even before the Great Depression, but it stayed in effect even during the Great Depression. Teachers were often had it written in their contract that if they got married, if a female teacher got married, she would lose her job, because the idea was that you shouldn't be taking a job that a man could have. So if you were an independent unmarried woman, then okay, you probably do need this job. But if you get married, then this job needs to go to somebody else. So the pay for the WPA depended upon the project, depended upon the part of the country you were in. There were varying per diems, and also your job skills. I remember hearing a very I think insightful story about a WPA project where there was a group of men working along this wall, and the foreman came over and he asked the first set of workers, what are you guys doing? And they said, I'm making 50 cents an hour laying these bricks. And then he went up the way a little bit and he said to the next batch of workers, what are you guys doing? And they said, well, we're making this wall. We're using these bricks to make this wall. And then he went up, the next batch, and he said, what are you guys doing? And the guy said, we're building a school. And what this did was it showed the level of interest of the three groups of guys. The first guys were just looking at it like a job. Hey, I'm making 50 cents an hour, just laying down these bricks. The next guys saw it as, just building a wall. I'm just building a wall. But the final guys got the big picture. I'm building a school. And when this school is done, hundreds and thousands of children will pass through these walls over the course of the coming decades. I am making a real contribution to my community. Regardless of how much money I'm making an important contribution. And that was really important for some folks. Oh, good. Hugs to all our librarians. Yeah, but only when it's safe. Let's see. As I understand it, there were quite a few magazines included. They might have contained recipes. Oh, that's a good point. That's a really good point. I bet you there were in some of the ladies' magazines, Ladies' Home Journal, Red Book, those sorts of things. Let's see. Have to bounce, but love the program. Many thanks, mate. Wonderful delivery. Oh, thank you. As my delivery, I hope, was as good as the pack horse librarians themselves. Let's see, recent novels about pack horse librarians, accurate. Depends on which ones you're talking about. There are two that are kind of out there as sort of the gold standards. One is The Bookwomen of Troublesome Creek, and the other one is The Giver of Stars. And these are books that take place in and around that time period. And by and large, they are accurate, but they are not books about the pack horse librarians per se. So the pack horse librarians are there to sort of carry the story. So there is probably some poetic license that was going on there as well. The mail carrier, stay warm tomorrow, 15 to 25 with the wind. Yeah, that's not going to be good.
Jeff, I've got some questions in the question box, and one was along with the $28 a month compared to the men. Another part of that question was, were married women employed or just single women?
As pack horse librarians, you mean?
Yes.
No, they were many of them were married women, but they were married women whose husbands weren't working or weren't at home working. So maybe, like, let's say they might go to Lexington, Kentucky to work on a courthouse or something like that as part of the WPA. So they were making some money. The men were making money at the WPA, but they weren't back home, with the women. So the women were able to provide a little bit of extra income that way as well. So generally speaking, these women were like 25 to 35 years old. And, obviously you could pretty much only take this job if you had someone to take care of your children. So there were, arrangements made for that. So Granny would come and take care of the kids while, because Granny's, 80, she's not going to get out on a horse and deliver books. So, maybe Mary Lou does that and Granny watches the kids while she's doing that. So they weren't all single women. They were married women as part of this as well. It's the teachers I was talking about. The teachers had it very often in their contracts that, if they got married, they lost their jobs.
And the last one here was, how many days would it take to complete a route? Would the women travel in pairs for safety, or was it one woman per route?
It's generally one woman per route. Safety was provided by the fact that you knew the territory, so you knew, don't go down the creek during rainy season, that sort of thing. Sometimes these women would carry, not a shotgun, but some kind of a sidearm of some kind. Mostly for scaring off animals or rattlesnakes, that sort of thing. There weren't too many folks out in that area that were out looking to harm people out in the wilderness and such. If you're going to rob these women, what are you going to get? Books? How useful is that going to be to you? I mean, it's very useful. Obviously, we know the value of books, but I'm saying, if you're going to rob somebody to try to, get money for food or something like that, the books aren't going to be able to be sold. Nobody else has any money out there. So there's usually one woman per route, and they could accept or decline the route if they thought it was too dangerous. They wouldn't take it. It was bear season, they would stay away from the bears, those sorts of things. And generally speaking, what they would try to do is to do a route per day. Now that means that you would go 18 or 20 miles over the course of the day, but you weren't out every day necessarily. So you would be out, maybe you're out 2 or 3 days of the week. And that also helped you in terms of your childcare back at home. And what you might do is set up places along, because once you get ready and get used to these routes, you might be able to set up sort of safe houses. Okay, I'll get to the Montgomery farm, and then Montgomery's will let me stay over, and then I can pick up from there and head back up the hill rather than come all the way back to town at the end of the night, that sort of thing. These were incredibly resourceful young women, who took what they had, what they could get, and they made the very absolute best of it, not only for themselves, but for the people of the area. Okay, anybody else? Oh, people saying nice things. Thank you very much. A presenter is only as good as his audience. So my hat's off and my hair's off to all of you as well. And of course for Toby, for discovering me and having me come in to do these things. So I'm very thankful for her for that as well. Is that it? Anybody else? Okie dokie. I think we've got some other things planned. If we don't, Toby and I can work that out if you guys find this to be useful. If you've got constructive criticism, send it in to her and she can share it with me. If you've got ideas for topics, you know, we can, we've got 17.5 million pages of documents at the Roosevelt Presidential Library. So if I don't already have a talk on something, chances are I can find the information to put one together for you, and I'd be happy to do that. In the meantime, everyone, please be safe. You know, be warm tomorrow, mail carrier, dress warmly, and everybody be safe. And, you know, we're going to get through this. Better days ahead. Franklin Delano Roosevelt stood down a Great Depression and a World War, and they got through it. We're going to get through this as well.
Thanks so much, Jeff. Thanks everybody for coming. Good night, everyone.